Teacher Talk, and my name is Vernon, and I'll be your teacher for the next half hour or so. We are discussing the book of Esther. We are in chapter 2. We discussed chapter 1 last week at length. Several of you said you enjoyed the video very much, and I appreciate that. So we're going to look at chapter 2 today. Now, remember that we said at the end of the last video that about 4 years have passed since the end of chapter 1 to the beginning of chapter 2. Xerxes the First, or Ahasuerus, as he's called in the book of Esther, which is his Hebrew name, had a planned invasion of Greece. And he did pretty well, and then he got defeated, and he came back with his tail between his legs. So there's a 4-year span between the end of chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2. So chapter 2 opens, and it says, after these things, and it's talking about all these things that have already happened, the war and the battle and everything. When the wrath of King Ahasuerus subsided, he remembered Vashti, what she had done, and what had been decreed against her. So if you remember, he had asked her at this big party that he was having before the Greek campaign started. He had asked her to come and wearing nothing but her crown into a room full of men who had been drinking wine for 7 days, and she refused. And he asked his advisors, what are we going to do? Nothing like this has ever happened before. They said, you need to send out an edict saying that the man is the king of his household and that the wife has to do what the man says. And you need to remove her as queen. And we need to select a new queen. Well, then the whole Greek campaign came into play, and he kind of forgot about the getting a new queen part. So after he'd gotten back home and he'd had time to lick his wounds and kind of reflect on, maybe what he'd done wrong during this war, he remembered, oh man, I don't have a queen. There's nobody come in here and give me hugs and tell me, I'm still a good guy and everything. So he realized that there was no queen. So verse 2 says, then the king's servants who attended him said, let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins to Shushan the citadel, into the women's quarters, under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, custodian of the women. And let beauty preparations be given them, and then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This thing pleased the king, and he did so. So basically, his advisors are saying, look, you need to have a Miss Persia beauty contest, basically. They said, go out through all the 120 provinces of your kingdom, bring in the most beautiful young virgins that you can find. We'll give them the best makeup, we'll give them the best shampoos, we'll give them beauty treatments, and then you can pick which one you want to be queen. So the king said, okay, yeah, let's do that. So this was not a voluntary thing, okay? The soldiers, the officers of the king, the representatives of the king would go into each province and ask for all the young virgins to be brought in, and they would pick the most beautiful young virgins, and they'd say, okay, you're going to the palace, and there was no choice in the matter. Verse 5 says, in Shushan the citadel, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives who had been captured with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. So this is going back to the book of Daniel, okay, or before the book of Daniel, when the Babylonian exile happened, okay, when Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem, and he took all the Jews into Babylon. And that's what the book of Daniel is about. So this man, Kish, had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives who'd been captured by Nebuchadnezzar. So he was part of this group that Daniel was in. And it says, Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother, and the young woman was lovely and beautiful. And when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So this man, Mordecai, he's a Jew. His cousin, Esther, Hadassah, her Hebrew name. Her mother and father are dead. We don't know why. We don't know what happened, but she has no parents. And Mordecai says, hey, I'll take her in. And he raised her as his own daughter. So it was in verse 8, when the king's command and decree were heard, and when many young women were gathered at Shushan the citadel, under the custody of Haggai, that Esther also was taken to the king's palace into the care of Haggai, the custodian of the women. So Esther is brought into this women's court at the palace. And historians tell us that, number one, Haggai is mentioned in the Greek historian Herodotus. In his writings, Haggai is mentioned as a very influential, high-ranking officer in the palace of Xerxes I. So Haggai actually did exist, and he was a servant of King Xerxes. Historians tell us that there were about 400 young virgins that were brought in for this choosing of the queen ceremony. So this was not just, a few virgins. This was 400 young virgins that were brought in. Verse 9 says, now the young woman pleased him, talking about Esther, and she obtained his favor, so he readily gave beauty preparations to her besides her allowance. So the story kind of reminds me of the story of Joseph. Remember when Joseph, he was sold into slavery by his brothers. He was bought as a slave in Egypt by Potiphar. He gained favor with Potiphar, and Potiphar made him servant and ruler over all his household. He was accused by Potiphar's wife of trying to sexually seduce her and was thrown into prison. In prison, he gained favor with the jailer, and the jailer gave him extra duties and special duties, and he finally was made like a trustee, what we would call a trustee today. So he had privileges that other prisoners didn't have. It says here that the young woman pleased Haggai, and she obtained his favor. So he's giving her extra beauty treatment. So these 400 young women are given makeup, perfumes, oils, shampoos, lotions, creams, all this stuff that the women back then would use to enhance their beauty. These women were probably given generic store brand stuff, Walmart stuff, okay, great value, that kind of stuff. Haggai, it says, he readily gave beauty preparations to her besides her allowance. She probably had some of the stuff that Queen Vashti had, oil of Olay and Mary Kay, and all the high-end stuff, the stuff from Neiman Marcus and Nordstrom's and Macy's. She had the store brand. She had the name brand stuff. So he gave her all that plus what she got from the queen or from the king on a regular basis. Then 7 choice maidservants were provided for her from the king's palace. So now, instead of having to share maybe 10 or 20 maidservants among 400 virgins, she gets 7 just for herself. And it says, he moved her and her maidservants to the best place in the house of the women. He may have moved her into Vashti's quarters since Vashti wasn't there anymore. So she gets her own private bedroom. She gets her own 7 private maidservants. She gets all the beauty preparations, all the makeup and cream and oils and shampoos and lotions that she could ever want for. Verse 10 says, Esther had not revealed her people or family, for Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it. Jews were considered inferior, okay? These were foreign nationals who had been brought into Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar. If they had been defeated, then they must be inferior, right? That was the thinking of the day. So Jews were not looked upon very favorably. They were despised, they were reviled, they were just looked down upon. So Mordecai had told her, don't tell anybody you're Jewish. So it was kind of like a don't ask, don't tell thing. You know, if they don't ask, don't tell them, don't volunteer the information. So it says every day in verse 11 that Mordecai paced in front of the court of the women's quarters to learn of Esther's welfare and what was happening to her. Mordecai's job, he had a small job, civil servant type position in the government. So he had access to the courtyard of the palace. And he had probably made arrangements with somebody that was in the women's court. And he would stand outside the balcony of the women's court, and somebody would come out every day and say, hey, Esther is okay, or Hadassah is okay, she's fine, she's found favor with the chief eunuch, so she's got her own quarters now, she's got her own maidservants, she's being cared for the best, she gets better food, she gets better makeup, everything's good. So Mordecai is keeping an eye on her. Verse 12, it says, each young woman's turn came to go into King Ahasuerus after she had completed 12 months of preparation according to the regulations for the women. So they come in, it's 12 months before any of them can get in to see the king. Okay, so now remember, you've got a 4-year period between chapter 1 and chapter 2. All right, you've got another 12 months between the beginning of chapter 2 before any of this planning and preparation comes to fruition. And it says 12 months preparation according to the regulations for the women. For thus were the days of their preparation apportioned, 6 months with oil of myrrh. So these women lived in a desert climate. They were young. Some of them were from higher class families. Some of them were from lower class families, but their skin was probably dry, maybe cracked, maybe wrinkled. Maybe they had bruises, maybe they had calluses, maybe they had scars from working. If they were from lower class families, many of them may have been underweight because of a lack of food or a lack of quality food. So 6 months were spent. Basically, it was a spa day every day for these young women. They would be bathed. They would be massaged. They would have this oil of myrrh rubbed into every part of their body to help moisturize their skin, to help heal any sores or wounds, to help beautify their skin and make it more glowing and more healthy. So 6 months of spa days, and then 6 months with perfumes and preparations for beautifying women. So then 6 months spa days plus makeup treatments. Okay, so they get their hair worked on every day. They get their skin worked on. They learn how to apply these perfumes that naturally make them smell better. Okay, you didn't have body spray and stuff back then. So again, being in a desert climate, no air conditioning, no ceiling fans, you got hot, you got sweaty. If you worked for a living, you probably didn't smell very good, whether you worked for a living or not, for that matter. So they had 6 months of beautifying treatments for their skin, and then they had 6 months of perfumes and oils and massages and baths and pedicures and manicures and just all this stuff. I mean, they were being pampered, whether they were from a well-off family or they were from poverty. They were being pampered in the palace. So one year of preparation. And verse 13 says, thus prepared, each young woman went to the king, and she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the women's quarters to the king's palace. And in the evening she went, and in the morning she returned to the second house of the women, to the custody of Shazgaz, the king's eunuch who kept the concubines. And she would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her and called for her by name. So she would go in. The king would say, okay, bring me another virgin. Bring me another one of the women. So she was allowed to bring in anything that she wanted when she went into the king. It could be a hair comb. It could be necklace, it could be a bracelet, it could be a teddy bear, it could be a mirror or a brush, whatever she wanted. One thing. She would go into the king that evening. She would lie with the king. In the morning, she would be gotten up. She would be taken to not back where she came from, where the virgins were, because she wasn't anymore. She would be taken to the second house of the women, where the concubines were. Now, the concubines were, in one sense of the word, they were wives of the king, but it wasn't a wife. She didn't have all the wifely rights and privileges of the king. It just meant that she had been with the king in that way, and she was accorded, good food, good, she had servants, she had, they were well treated. But being a concubine of the king, you couldn't just go to the king and say, hey, I'd like to be with you tonight. He had to call for you by name, and you were not allowed to leave the palace, and you were not allowed to marry. You were not allowed to have a boyfriend for the rest of your life. So basically, they lived as widows in a sense, because the king usually didn't call for them twice, and for the rest of their lives. So it was not a fairy tale existence. It was not a storybook kind of, prince and princess, king and queen kind of thing. They were just there in case the queen was gone, or in case the queen was, the king was mad at the queen or something. They were just there. And if he wanted them, they were there. And if he didn't want them, they were still there. So it wasn't a bad life, but it wasn't a great life either. So verse 15 says, now when the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her in as his daughter, to go into the king, she requested nothing but what Haggai, the king's eunuch, the custodian of the women, advised. So she said, I don't want to bring anything in unless you tell me to bring it in. So she trusted him because he had shown her favor. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her. So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight as more than all the virgins. So he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So now we don't know if she was the last one to go in and he liked her more than all the others, or if she, went in before some of them got to go in, and he decided right then and there, okay, she's the one that I want. I don't need to see anymore. We're not told that, but we're just told that he fell in love with her, and she's the one that he wanted. So it says, then the king made a great feast, the feast of Esther, and for all his officials and servants, and he proclaimed a holiday in the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of a king. So now we have a new queen. Nobody knows that she's Jewish. That would be a scandal. Oh my goodness, a Jew on the throne. What's going to happen? The empire is going to fall. So nobody knows she's Jewish, but she's beautiful. The queen loves her. The queen adores her. And so he's made a festival, the festival of Esther. Everybody gets gifts according to the generosity of the king. Everybody's happy. There's fireworks. There's a big celebration, and everybody's happy. Now, the last part of chapter 2 tells us, when virgins were gathered together a second time, Mordecai sat within the king's gate. So I don't know if this is a second beauty pageant. Maybe some of his concubines had died and he needed to replenish the herd, or, I don't know. But anyway, it says, when they were gathered together a second time, Mordecai sat within the king's gate. So Mordecai had a job, and he had been promoted apparently, because he used to work outside the king's gate. Now it says he sat inside the king's gate. So he's closer to the inner workings of the palace. Okay. And it says, Esther had not revealed her family and her people, just as Mordecai had charged her. And in those days, in verse 21, while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. The king had done something to tick him off. Okay, these are doorkeepers. They open the door, they shut the door, they don't let anybody in that doesn't have authorization to go in. And the king had, looked at them wrong, or the king had, told them they were stupid, or, whatever. The king had done something to make them angry, and they started plotting against the king. And they say, we need to kill him. We need to kill this dude, this guy that just, we didn't deserve that. Blah, 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 blah. So the matter became known to Mordecai. Mordecai heard them talking. He heard them plotting this assassination of the king. Mordecai told Queen Esther, it says in verse 22, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. So Esther goes to the king. She says, Your Majesty, there's a man in the kingdom named Mordecai, and he has heard of an assassination plot against Your Majesty. And these are the two men that were doing it, that are planning it. And he just wanted to make sure that you knew about it so you could do something about it. And when an inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both were hanged on a gallows, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. So they got them together. They asked him. They finally, got the truth out of him. Yes, we were planning to kill him, but we were just talking. We really didn't mean it. We wouldn't have killed him. Long live the king. We love the king, blah, blah, blah. And nobody believed him. And so they were hanged. Now, when it says they were hanged, back then they weren't really hanged like we think, like of, the Old West, where, the whole town gathers to see somebody get hung and they get a rope around their neck, and, it wasn't a hanging like that. What they usually meant when somebody said they were hanged is that they were impaled on a stake. And this is a little graphic, but this is history. This is the way it was, and I'm not going to sugarcoat anything. They would take a wooden stake and drive it into the ground, and it was pointed at the top, very sharp point at the top of this wooden stake. They would take the prisoner, who was most likely unclothed. They would take the prisoner and they would lower the prisoner down onto this stake until the stake entered the lower opening of the digestive tract, if you get my point. They would continue to push this person down on the stake, so the stake would go up through their body and it would come out their neck. And they would leave the person there until they died. The person usually, according to historians of the time, the person would usually last several days in excruciating pain. The birds would come and pluck their eyes out and feed on their flesh. And their hands were usually tied behind them so they couldn't fight off the birds or the animals. And, they would possibly bleed out. But usually they didn't bleed out. They would just lay there and just die of exposure, die of malnutrition, die of dehydration, die from have your eyes plucked out by birds and stuff. Anyway, it was not a very comfortable death. It wasn't a very quick death by any means. And that's how people were executed back then. Now, it says here that it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. That's important. It's going to play into the story later on. But anything that was happened, the Chronicles of the king were records of what happened during the king's reign. If anything notable happened, it was written in the Chronicles. And on this day, 2 prisoners were hanged for trying to assassinate the king. And the plot was made known to the king by way of a citizen by the name of Mordecai, something like that. And it was a record of what happened. So that's how chapter 2 closes out. the story is starting to pick up now. It's starting to gain a little bit of steam, starting to gain some momentum. Things are going to start happening now. We've gone through chapter 1. We've gone through chapter 2. Things have, the stage has been set, if you will. And so some things are going to start happening. So I hope you've enjoyed chapter 2 here. And next time we'll look at chapter 3. If you have any prayer requests or something, you know how to get a hold of me. Send me prayer requests, concerns, questions about the lessons, and have a great week. God bless you, and we will see you next time.